Black Navy SEAL accused of assaulting a white police officer. No weapon, no footage, just one man's word, and a system ready to believe the worst. When Tariq Dawson walked into that courtroom, he wasn't just a defendant. He was already a threat to their image, their comfort, their control. The judge didn't hesitate. "Cuff him," he said. Right there, in front of everyone. No questions, no defense. But Tariq didn't panic, because he knew something they didn't. And within minutes, everything they built around him would start to crack. What kind of man turns a courtroom built to crush him into a room forced to listen? Like, comment, and subscribe. Then come see how it all began. He didn't walk like a guilty man. He didn't walk like a hero either. Tariq Dawson stepped through the courthouse doors in a plain gray suit, shoes clean but worn, hands at his sides. No medals, no military stripes, no lawyers flanking him like armor. Just him. A black man walking into a courtroom full of white faces, knowing exactly how they'd already written his story. He looked around once. Not long. Just enough to feel the chill in the air. The kind of silence that doesn't come from respect, but expectation. The kind that says, "Sit down, don't speak. We already know who you are." At the front sat Judge Whitmore. Silver hair, eyes like ice. He didn't look at Tariq as he entered, didn't nod, didn't blink. Just scribbled something down and waited for the room to settle, as if he'd seen enough from the moment the door opened, as if his verdict had arrived before Tariq ever did. On the prosecution bench sat Officer Dwyer. Broad shoulders, clean shave, a uniform pressed so sharp it looked starched in hate. He leaned back in his seat with that same smirk he wore in the booking photo, the kind that says, "I got him." Not because of what Tariq did, but because of who he was. The charge was simple: assaulting a police officer, inside a precinct. No camera footage, no bruises on Dwyer's body worth noting, no weapon found on Tariq. Just a report, and the unwavering word of a white cop against a black man. As Tariq sat, the tension in the room didn't ease. In fact, it thickened. The bailiff watched him too closely. The clerk typed too slowly. A woman in the front row clutched her purse like it might fly off her lap. Every movement was heavy, like the floor itself disapproved of him being there. The court-appointed attorney beside Tariq leaned in. Young, nervous, barely out of law school by the look of him. His voice dropped to a whisper. "Stay calm, Mr. Dawson. Don't speak unless asked." Tariq didn't respond. He just looked straight ahead. The same way he'd looked on missions, when no one knew what would happen next, but someone had to hold the line. Judge Whitmore cleared his throat and began, his tone sharp and final. "This court is now in session. We are here to address the matter of State of Georgia versus Tariq A. Dawson, charged with assault and obstruction during lawful detainment." He paused, eyes finally lifting toward Tariq. There was no curiosity in them, no patience, just the cold satisfaction of a man who believed he already understood the world. "A decorated Navy SEAL. That's what I've been told," Whitmore said, almost casually. One might expect better judgment from someone trained to protect the public, not attack its officers. Tariq didn't flinch. He didn't need to, because he knew what this was. Dwyer stood to read his statement. His voice carried, loud, clear, and practiced. The defendant entered the station agitated, confrontational. When I asked him to remove his jacket, he refused. When I approached, he raised his voice and shoved me back. A few heads in the room nodded, not because they believed it, but because they wanted to. It fit the story they already told themselves. Tariq turned slightly, not to Dwyer, but to the space between them. His voice didn't rise, it didn't crack, it just existed, like truth often does. "I never touched him." The room went quiet, not because they were listening, but because they didn't want to hear that. Whitmore leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench. "We'll let the evidence speak, Mr. Dawson." But there was none. The body cam footage Dwyer claimed was corrupted. The security feed was mysteriously unavailable. All that remained was testimony. And in this courtroom, testimony had a color. From the back of the room, someone whispered, "That's the guy from the news, the SEAL." Someone else replied, "Doesn't matter. They said he went violent." The attorney raised a hand. "Your Honor, we'd like to request a delay until the body cam footage can be recovered." "No," Whitmore interrupted. "We will proceed. No hesitation, no deliberation, just command." Like Tariq's past, his service, his sacrifice meant nothing now. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Tariq for the first time. Not like a man seeing another man, but like a mechanic examining a damaged part. "You may have worn a uniform," he said, "but in this courtroom, you're just another defendant." Tariq held his stare, unmoved. And then came the words that shifted the air. "Some men walk into court already sentenced, not by law, not by truth, but by skin." No one said it out loud, but everyone in that room felt it. The war Tariq thought he left behind had just changed battlefields. There's a way they teach you to describe a threat, not by what he did, but by what he looks like. Dwyer stood in front of the court like a man rehearsing a ghost story. He spoke slowly, choosing each word with surgical precision. He was unstable, aggressive in posture. I gave him 3 verbal commands. He ignored every one. The jury took that in like gospel. Not one asked what those commands were. Not one wondered why a decorated Navy SEAL would suddenly snap in a public precinct in broad daylight with no weapon and no motive. "He squared up," Dwyer added. "Like he wanted to fight. I feared for my safety." That last line was the dagger. Not because it was true, but because it didn't have to be. Fear in a courtroom like this isn't measured by fact. It's measured by color. Judge Whitmore folded his hands and looked over at the defense table. The young court-appointed attorney cleared his throat and rose, clearly unprepared for the windstorm headed his way. "Your Honor, we're still waiting on confirmation from the department regarding the body cam footage. It may have what?" Whitmore cut in, his voice sharp, vanished into thin air. The room chuckled lightly. Dwyer didn't smile, but he looked satisfied, like the laugh belonged to him. "We're requesting a brief continuance, Your Honor," the lawyer continued, flustered. "We believe the footage is critical to evaluating the veracity of Officer Dwyer's account." Whitmore leaned back in his chair. His pause was deliberate, like a cat playing with a mouse it no longer needed to chase. "This court doesn't wait on fairy tales, Counselor." Then he turned to the jury and added, almost as an aside, "It's amazing how often evidence gets lost when someone's trying to delay the obvious." That line stuck. It wasn't just a dismissal. It was a warning, not to Tariq, but to anyone who might dare believe him. At the defense table, Tariq said nothing. His hands rested on his knees, fingers interlocked. His shoulders didn't shift. His gaze didn't waver. He looked like a man who had learned long ago that protest only fed the fire. Because in rooms like this, silence was not consent. It was survival. Dwyer returned to his seat. As he passed Tariq, their eyes met for half a second. That was all. Dwyer looked at him the way a hunter might look at the trophy wall in his basement. With pride, with entitlement. Not because he feared Tariq, but because he believed deep down that the system belonged to him. The jury, mostly white and middle-aged, watched Tariq the way one watches a dog behind a fence. Still, quiet, but always in their mind, potentially dangerous. Tariq's attorney tried again, this time with less confidence. "Your Honor, we respectfully submit that proceeding without the body cam risks a miscarriage of justice." Judge Whitmore didn't even blink. "This court proceeds with the testimony at hand. The officer's account stands unless proven otherwise. And so far, I see nothing in this room that proves otherwise." A small rustle moved through the benches. It wasn't loud, but it was telling. The sound of people settling into a conclusion before the story was done. Tariq adjusted slightly, not in protest, not in frustration. Just enough to stretch his fingers, which had begun to stiffen from the cold tension in the room. He looked forward again, not at Whitmore, not at Dwyer, but at something past them, something they couldn't see. The attorney leaned over, whispering, "We'll try to bring it up again later. Just hold steady." Tariq nodded once, barely. It was then that a woman in the gallery whispered to her friend, "Didn't he used to be in the military?" The reply came with a shrug. "That don't mean he didn't do it. You know how they get after combat." "They." One word, said soft, cuts hard. Judge Whitmore tapped his pen against the bench. "Let the record show that the defendant has offered no direct rebuttal to the officer's statement." Of course he hadn't. There was nothing to rebut when the whole process was scripted. In that courtroom, Tariq wasn't a SEAL, wasn't a veteran, wasn't a father or a neighbor. He was a symbol, built for the state to destroy in plain view. No explosion, no outrage, just a clean, quiet dismantling. And in that stillness, the system looked calm. But it wasn't calm. It was satisfied. Because the structure doesn't need to scream to crush you. It just needs you to sit there while it does. The room had been holding its breath since the last testimony ended. Judge Whitmore scribbled something on his notepad with the careless hand of someone who had already made up his mind. The jury shifted, restless. Then Officer Dwyer rose again with a look on his face like he'd been waiting for this exact moment. "Your Honor," he said, turning only halfway toward the bench. "Based on the defendant's demeanor, I believe he may be emotionally unstable. For the safety of everyone here, I respectfully request that he be restrained." There was no twitch, no raised voice, no sign from Tariq, nothing. He hadn't moved an inch since the hearing began. But Dwyer made it sound like a ticking bomb was seated beside his lawyer. Whitmore didn't even glance at Tariq before speaking. Granted, that word fell like a gavel itself. Just one syllable, but it echoed in every corner of that courtroom like a declaration. No counsel input, no second look, just granted. The bailiff hesitated for half a breath. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was discomfort. But that moment passed quickly. Orders were orders. Then something strange happened. Tariq didn't flinch. He stood up slowly, not in protest, not in fear, just steady, deliberate movement. He extended both hands forward, wrists together, as if he'd done it before, as if he knew exactly what would happen before it did. And somehow that stillness made the entire room uneasy. The metallic click of handcuffs broke the silence. Not because it was loud, but because it wasn't supposed to happen here. Not in the middle of a courtroom. Not in front of the jury. Not to a man who hadn't raised his voice once. From the back row, a voice cut through the quiet. "This is wrong." Heads turned. It was a woman, mid-40s maybe, dressed in a deep blue blouse and holding a handbag against her chest like a shield. Her voice trembled, but not with fear. It trembled with rage. "You all see what's happening," she said louder now. "Y'all really gonna sit there and act like this is normal?" Whitmore slammed his palm on the bench. "Order in the court." But the tension had already shifted. Something in the air had cracked. Tariq turned his head just slightly toward the woman and gave the smallest nod, like he understood her outrage, but didn't want her to carry the burden alone. He looked back to the bench, wrists now bound in steel, and said in a calm, steady tone, "You're not restraining me. You're just comforting yourselves." It was the kind of sentence that didn't need to be repeated to be remembered. Even Dwyer blinked. Judge Whitmore leaned forward, jaw tight, but he didn't respond. Maybe he realized that pushing back now would only expose more than he was ready to answer for. The woman in blue was escorted out gently by another bailiff, but her words still hung in the air, like smoke after a slow fire. The courtroom grew quieter than it had all day. The jurors avoided eye contact with one another. The prosecutor scribbled notes that didn't matter. Tariq sat back down, cuffed, spine straight, shoulders squared, eyes forward. He didn't need to shout, he didn't need to beg. He'd already told them everything they needed to hear. They just had to decide whether they were willing to listen. They tried to make him disappear behind silence and steel, but there are stories that refuse to stay buried. Tariq sat with his wrists still cuffed, his back straight, his eyes never blinking. The courtroom had seen men fidget, tremble, shout. Tariq did none of those things. And that, somehow, unsettled them even more. His court-appointed lawyer finally spoke. The man had barely said a word the entire morning, his voice thin and hesitant, but now he cleared his throat and stood up, trying to seem bigger than he felt. "For the record," he began, "Mr. Tariq Dawson served 14 years in the United States Navy. He was part of SEAL Team 6. He led classified missions that protected this country at the highest levels. He has been decorated for valor, for restraint, and for acts most of us wouldn't survive, let alone volunteer for." The judge barely looked up. His pen moved in tiny, meaningless circles on the notepad in front of him. Then he said it flatly, like brushing dust off a coat sleeve. "This is not a battlefield, counselor. It's a courtroom." There was a pause that didn't feel like silence. It felt like something cracking. Tariq didn't respond. Not at first, but his jaw tightened ever so slightly, and the temperature in the room seemed to shift. In the back, an older man, skin weathered like desert rock, the kind of man who had seen too much and spoken too little, took off his cap. It was an old Navy ball cap, frayed at the edges, with a faded patch that read USS Carl Vinson. He pressed the cap to his chest and looked at Tariq, and for a moment his lips trembled. He didn't say a word, but the tears in his eyes said more than any statement could. And then the memory came. It was years ago, in a dirt-slick forward base in Afghanistan. Tariq had been one of 3 Black SEALs on his unit. The others were gone now. One to shrapnel, one to a discharge that came with whispers and no explanation. They had taken a hill together, neutralized a threat, extracted a hostage. After the dust cleared, a young private, white, scared, bleeding from the side, looked at Tariq and said, "Didn't expect you to be the one saving me." Tariq didn't answer. He just handed him water and kept walking. But the next day, back on base, he heard it in the showers. Someone called him a war dog, said it with a smile, like a compliment, and the room had laughed. After that, he learned that bravery had limits. Some uniforms made you invisible, even when you bled for them. Back in the courtroom, Tariq looked ahead. He said nothing. But everyone could feel it, the weight of a man who had fought for a country that refused to fight for him. The judge was still writing, still refusing to meet his eyes, and the cuffs on Tariq's wrists caught the light again, glinting like chains. The older veteran in the gallery finally leaned toward the person beside him and whispered, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. Out there, he was a hero. Back home, they call him a threat. No one answered. No one corrected him. Because that sentence didn't need defense. It was already the truth. In that moment, it was no longer about guilt or innocence. It was about what this country chooses to see and what it chooses to ignore. And still, Tariq sat without moving. Not because he was powerless, but because he understood something most men never do. That sometimes the loudest fight is the one where you say nothing and make the world feel it anyway. The courtroom had gone still again. But not because of fear. It was the kind of silence that comes when something unexpected enters the room. Not loud, not disruptive, just out of place enough to demand attention. A woman rose from the second bench near the aisle. She was calm, but her eyes carried weight. The kind of weight that doesn't come from anger, but from memory. She walked forward with a quiet steadiness, holding a small black drive in one hand. Judge Whitmore glanced up, visibly annoyed. "Ma'am, if you are not counsel or listed on the docket, I'll have to ask you to return to your seat," he said coldly. "My name is Dr. Nia Ellis," she said, her voice controlled. "And I have evidence this court has not seen. Footage that was deleted from the precinct server before the investigation even began." There was a pause. Not dramatic, not cinematic. Just a real, uncomfortable beat where no one knew what would happen next. She placed the external hard drive on the prosecution table. One of the younger clerks looked to the judge, unsure whether to touch it. Judge Whitmore didn't blink. "There is a procedure for evidence submission, Doctor. You're interrupting an ongoing hearing." "The chain of custody was broken long before I walked in here," she replied. "I recovered this from an off-site backup. Your Honor, this is the original footage from the station's security system. I have it time-stamped, verified and mirrored with metadata. That got people sitting up straighter." A murmur rippled through the room, followed by the quick shuffle of attorneys exchanging glances. Whitmore narrowed his eyes. "And how exactly did you come to possess this alleged footage?" Dr. Ellis took a breath. "My ex-husband was Major Stephen Ellis. He served with Officer Dwyer. They were close, until Stephen realized Dwyer had a habit of escalating situations involving black men. After Stephen died in a car crash last year, I was sent his digital archives. It was there I found this backup, footage Dwyer never thought anyone would see again." Whitmore sat back, arms crossed. "And you expect me to admit this into the record? A civilian appearing unannounced with a drive claiming to be the missing link?" The prosecutor stood, looking unsure. "Your Honor, if we—" "No," Whitmore cut him off. "There's no verified chain of custody. No official validation from a forensics team. This is hearsay dressed up in emotion." Tariq didn't move. He hadn't moved since the woman entered. But then, for the first and only time, his court-appointed attorney cleared his throat. The man had barely spoken more than a few words since the hearing began. Now, with a quiet voice and a calm demeanor, he rose to his feet. "Your Honor," he said, Under Rule 902 of the Federal Rules of Evidence, digitally stored video files, verified through standard metadata and unaltered timestamps, may be admitted without testimony if their authenticity is uncontested and the defense can verify source credibility. Whitmore blinked. The attorney continued, "The department has failed to provide the original footage. This witness provides a version backed by clear technical validation. In light of her connection to a previously involved officer, the court would be denying material evidence if it refuses to at least review the content." It was the longest sentence the man had spoken all day, and for the first time, Whitmore didn't have an immediate retort. He looked at Dr. Ellis, then at the drive. "Fine," he said curtly. "Load it. We'll view the footage, but let the record show I find the method of introduction highly irregular." Dr. Ellis gave a small nod, then stepped back, eyes never leaving Tariq. She had said her part. She had done her part. The clerk plugged the drive into the courtroom monitor. The screen blinked to life, and for a brief moment, no one breathed. What came next would change everything. The screen lit up with a soft blue glow, and the courtroom held its breath. At first, the footage was silent. No timestamp, no commentary, just a grainy hallway of the Riverhaven precinct. Tariq was seated in a chair against the wall, wrists resting on his knees. His expression calm, unreadable. There were no raised voices, no signs of resistance. Until Officer Dwyer entered the frame. He didn't walk in like someone clocking in for duty. He walked in like he had something to prove, like he'd been waiting for this moment. He stood over Tariq, speaking. The footage had no audio, but the body language was unmistakable. Jabbing a finger, leaning too close, then pacing. Then turning suddenly and slamming both palms into the wall, just inches from Tariq's head. Someone in the courtroom gasped. The next frame played with audio. "You think wearing that uniform makes you more than me?" Dwyer barked, face flushed with heat. "You people don't know your place anymore." Tariq didn't flinch. He didn't rise. He didn't speak. Dwyer continued. "You think that SEAL badge means anything in here?" And finally, Tariq answered. His voice was calm, low, and even. "You don't own me, not out there, not in here, not even when I wear this uniform." It was quiet. Not a heroic line, not a threat, just a truth laid bare, clean and sharp as a blade. Then, without warning, Dwyer grabbed Tariq by the front of his shirt and shoved him backward, hard. The chair toppled. Tariq hit the ground but didn't strike back. He didn't even raise his arms. The courtroom recoiled. Someone said, "Jesus." The video cut for a second, then resumed. Tariq was back in the chair. A different officer, older, visibly disturbed, stepped into the frame. Tried to pull Dwyer back. Dwyer shrugged him off. Then came the final line, caught perfectly on camera. "You may think you're protected," Dwyer hissed, "but in this building, you're just another threat we're allowed to put down." That was the moment Whitmore rose from the bench. "Turn it off," he snapped. No one moved. "I said turn it off." His voice cracked, sharp and brittle. The clerk looked up, terrified, but Tariq's attorney leaned over and whispered something. The video continued. It showed Dwyer leaving the room, adjusting his collar. Tariq, still seated, slowly sat upright and stared at the camera. He didn't blink. He didn't speak. He just looked. And it was that silence that burned the most. When the footage ended, no one applauded, no one shouted, but the air felt scorched, thick with realization. People were breathing differently now. Judge Whitmore slammed his gavel, once, twice. The sound echoed, but it didn't carry authority. It sounded like panic. "This court will now recess," he began. Tariq finally looked up, looked directly at Whitmore. "You don't want the truth," he said, his voice calm but cutting. "You want surrender, and I don't owe you that." It wasn't said loud, but it was said loud enough. The courtroom didn't erupt. It didn't need to. The weight of what they had all seen did the speaking. And from that moment on, no one in the room could pretend they didn't know. Because when a lie burns that hot, it leaves no room for shadows. The judge called for a brief recess, but no one moved. The room didn't breathe the same way anymore. Something had shifted, and even those who pretended not to see now found themselves blinking into the light of the truth. Whitmore sat stiffly, his fingers tightening around the armrests of his chair. His gavel sat idle, a useless symbol now. He tried clearing his throat, but the sound fell flat. It was the first time all morning he looked smaller than the bench he sat on. The clerk whispered something, but Whitmore didn't hear. He was staring at Tariq, who sat perfectly still, his hands folded neatly, eyes cast forward, not smug, not angry, just certain. And then, for the first time since he entered that courtroom, Tariq smiled. Barely. A quiet curl at the corner of his mouth, not out of victory or satisfaction. It was the kind of smile you see on someone who already knew the outcome long before the game began. He leaned just slightly and whispered to his attorney, who didn't reply. The lawyer simply nodded, straightened a single piece of paper on the table, and waited. That's when Whitmore stood up. Abruptly. Too fast. He adjusted his robe as if to remind the room he was still the one in charge. But no one was watching him anymore. Because at the very back of the room, a man in a gray suit rose to his feet. He wasn't part of the gallery. He hadn't said a word. He'd been there all morning, sitting in the last row, not blinking, not shifting. Now with quiet precision he turned and walked out the door. No one stopped him. No one asked who he was. But his presence had weight, like a thread being pulled from fabric, unraveling everything it passed through. Tariq didn't turn to watch him go. He didn't need to. Whitmore, on the other hand, suddenly looked rattled. He shuffled papers that didn't need shuffling. He glanced toward the exit. He wiped his forehead with a folded handkerchief that appeared from nowhere. And in the stillness, Tariq spoke again. Just loud enough for those closest to hear. Even silence has weight. You only notice it when it shifts the room. It wasn't defiant. It wasn't for show. It was observation. Like he wasn't fighting the system. He was letting it reveal itself. Someone in the gallery coughed. Another adjusted their seat. And in that collective discomfort, the entire courtroom seemed to tilt. Something invisible had changed. The system was no longer just grinding forward. It was hesitating. For the first time, it seemed unsure of its next move. Not because of a loud protest or a dramatic speech, but because one man refused to play the part they'd written for him. There was power in that refusal. Not the kind you declare, the kind you wear quietly. Judge Whitmore tried to speak. His voice cracked. This court will reconvene in 15 minutes. He stood, walked off the bench without looking at anyone. His back stiff, his steps too quick. No one followed. Tariq remained seated, calm. That faint smile now gone, replaced by something heavier, but also clearer. He glanced at the camera mounted on the far wall. A red light blinked. The whole world would soon see what had been hidden. And somewhere far beyond that room, phones were already ringing. Emails were already opened. One man's silence had just echoed through a very loud system, because not all authority wears a robe. Some wear quiet, until they choose not to. When the courtroom reconvened, the air felt thinner. People sat differently. Straighter backs, quieter breaths. Even the walls somehow seemed to be listening. Tariq was already seated when the judge returned. Calm, composed, his hands resting gently on the edge of the table. Whitmore's robe looked heavier now, as if it carried more than fabric. His eyes darted toward the man in the gray suit's empty seat at the back. It hadn't been filled again. It didn't need to be. Then the courtroom doors opened. A young man in a navy uniform walked in, silent as shadow. He carried a slim envelope, sealed and crisp. Walked straight to the defense table and handed it to Tariq's attorney. Then he left. No salute. No word. The lawyer, usually forgettable, suddenly looked taller. He held the envelope like it contained a verdict of its own, then turned to the judge. "Your Honor," he said with clarity that startled even the stenographer. "We've received an official communique from the Department of Defense. Sealed. Marked urgent." Whitmore hesitated, then motioned him forward. The courtroom watched as he slit the envelope open with a practiced finger. His eyes scanned the first page, then the second. And something changed. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but the shift in his expression was unmistakable. Arrogance drained from his face like color from a dying light bulb. His lips parted, his hand trembled just slightly as he reached for the phone by his bench. He dialed. A pause. Then he stood straighter, as if the voice on the other end had slapped his spine into position. "Yes," Whitmore said quietly. "I'm looking at the letter now. Can you confirm this?" Silence. Then the answer came, loud enough that even the front row could hear. "He is active. Protected. Direct authorization." Whitmore didn't speak for a full 5 seconds. When he did, his voice lacked all the steel it had earlier. "This court," he said slowly, "dismisses all charges against Mr. Tariq Dawson. Effective immediately, this proceeding is concluded." The words hung in the air like smoke. No cheers, no gasps, just the silence of a room realizing it had been part of something much bigger than itself. Tariq didn't move. He didn't even blink. It was Whitmore who avoided his eyes now. The judge stood, adjusted his robe, and walked out without another word. His steps were quicker this time, almost like retreat. The gallery remained seated. No one left. No one spoke. Only the lawyer turned to Tariq, placed a hand gently on his shoulder, and whispered something no one else could hear. Tariq nodded once, and still, no sound. Because what happened next wasn't something that needed noise. It didn't require speeches or drama. It required gravity. And gravity was everywhere now. Even the court officers looked uncertain. One reached for his radio, then hesitated. Another took a step toward Tariq, then stopped himself, as if some unspoken line had been crossed and they weren't sure which side they stood on anymore. And Tariq, still, steady, unmoved, stood up. Not to celebrate, not to gloat, but to leave. That was all. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a man can do is simply walk out of the place that tried to define him, on his terms. And that's what he did. Walked out of the courtroom without looking back. Past the pews of people who now saw him not as a defendant, not even as a Navy SEAL, but as something harder to name. Something that made them examine their own silence. And in the stillness he left behind, one truth remained. Real power doesn't demand the room. It changes it by standing still. The courtroom had just fallen into the kind of silence that doesn't ask for attention. It commands it. Every breath, every shift in a seat, felt amplified in the absence of Whitmore's voice. He sat frozen behind the bench, pale and sweating, eyes darting between the sealed envelopes still on the table, and the man who had just stood and walked to the center of the courtroom without being told to. Tariq Dawson stood tall. No cuffs on his wrists, no hesitation in his posture. Just presence. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence had more weight now than the judge's gavel ever did. He slowly turned to face the courtroom. Not like a defendant asking for mercy, but like a man returning to reclaim something that had been stolen quietly, deliberately. The same courtroom that once looked at him with suspicion now couldn't look away. Then it happened. One woman in the back row rose to her feet. She looked to be in her 60s, white hair pulled into a tight bun, wearing a faded VFW pin on her coat. Her expression didn't waver, just pride. No applause, no words, just stillness. Another stood, then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire room was on its feet. White, black, old, young. Some were from the press, some were strangers. Others had likely come in expecting a routine court proceeding and instead found themselves witnessing something historic. Not a verdict, not an acquittal, something deeper, a reckoning. No one instructed them. No one moved first. It was as if the room itself knew what dignity looked like when it rose from the ashes of injustice. And today, that dignity had a name. Tariq Dawson. Tariq didn't smile. He didn't raise a hand. He simply turned to Whitmore one last time. Their eyes met. It wasn't anger Tariq gave him. It was something worse. Recognition. The look you give a man who had power and chose cruelty anyway. The look you give someone who built their throne on silence and was now being stripped of it, piece by piece in front of the very people they once ruled. Whitmore shifted uncomfortably in his chair, no longer the master of the room. His robe looked heavier now, too formal for someone who had been so publicly undone. Then came the sound that cut through everything. Not a shout, not a cry, but a single sentence from an elderly black man seated near the front. He didn't have to yell, he just stood. It echoed, not in volume, but in impact. The courtroom didn't erupt, it didn't cheer, it breathed. Some wiped their eyes, some stood with fists clenched at their sides, holding back decades of memory and fury. But no one sat down. Tariq slowly walked past the benches. Every step he took felt like a reclamation, not just of his innocence, but of his humanity. Every person he passed looked at him not as a man once accused, but as a man finally seen. Near the door, a young black boy no more than 10 stood next to his father, his eyes locked onto Tariq's. Without thinking, he whispered to his dad, "I want to be like him." His father didn't respond. He just gripped the boy's shoulder a little tighter, nodding slowly. By the time Tariq reached the exit, the room hadn't moved. Still standing, still quiet. Because in that moment, there was no debate, no question, no argument about what had just happened. A man had walked into that courtroom, judged by the color of his skin. He left judged by the strength of his spirit. And that kind of verdict, it doesn't get filed in records, it gets remembered. The final line of narration settles in. Dignity does not shout, it rises. The courtroom sat in a strange silence. Tariq Dawson stood alone now, no longer in handcuffs, no longer shackled by accusation. For the first time since the trial began, he didn't just exist in the room, he took it. He stepped forward slowly, his boots pressing into the floor like they had weight, not just from his body, but from everything he'd carried to that moment. His eyes never left Judge Whitmore's. The same judge who once refused to see a man, only a label. Aggressor. Threat. Criminal. Now that same judge couldn't hold his gaze for more than a second. Tariq stopped in the middle of the room, turned to the gallery, then back to the bench. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I didn't come here for your sympathy," he said quietly, but the words echoed through every corner. "I came here because the truth deserves a place to stand." Whitmore shifted in his seat. "This courtroom is not your stage, Mr. Dawson." Tariq looked up at him, not defiant, not angry, just steady. "No," he replied, "it never was, but it was always your mirror." There was a moment, one that stretched too long to be comfortable, where no one breathed. Then, a man in the back slowly stood up. An older gentleman, black, dressed in a modest gray suit. He didn't say a word, he just stood. Then another person rose. A white woman this time, middle-aged, her eyes wet. She clutched her purse to her chest, then stood tall beside the man. And then more. Row after row. Some black, some white, some in uniforms, some in suits. One man had tears on his cheek he didn't bother to wipe. Another woman pressed her hands together like a prayer. They weren't clapping, they weren't shouting, but no one sat. Tariq looked around the room and whispered, "I didn't ask for this." Whitmore watched, lips tight. "You don't have to ask," the older man in the back finally said. "You already earned it." The judge's gavel twitched in his hand, but he didn't bang it. Tariq turned back toward him. "You remember what you said to me the first day?" he asked. Whitmore didn't answer. "You said this courtroom doesn't wait for fairy tales." He paused, letting the weight of the memory hang. "Well, Judge," Tariq said, "this wasn't a fairy tale. It was just a man trying to tell the truth before you cut him off." Whitmore leaned forward. "You were charged with assaulting an officer." "And that officer," Tariq said, "assaulted the truth, and you let him." More people stood. The gallery was no longer just observers. It had become something else, a witness to justice that never came through procedure, but through clarity. Tariq took one last look around. His voice softened. Dignity doesn't raise its voice, it rises. Then he turned, walking away from the bench without permission, without hesitation, like he owned the floor he had once been dragged across. And still no one sat, not because someone told them to, not because it was expected, but because something had shifted in that room. Not the law, the standard. Some stories don't need loud voices or big moments to leave a mark. Sometimes it's the quiet ones that stay with us the longest. Tariq's story reminds us that dignity doesn't shout. It stands. It endures. And in a world that often judges by skin before truth, real justice is found in those who refuse to be broken. If this story meant something to you, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who still believes in the power of truth, and subscribe to Handcuffed for more stories that speak straight to the heart. Your support helps our team keep doing what we love, telling stories that matter. Because here at Handcuffed, we don't just tell stories, we help people remember.